Good morning. This is a uh, recording of Archaeology 2, meaning the fundamentals of archaeology. And I want to discuss with you what is so relevant about archaeology technique. What's relevant is that it's very formalized, and we will go through some of the processes that take place in the archaeological uh, experiment or endeavor. First, let's decide that people are very messy, and we have realized that in the last 2 million years, people have left an extraordinary amount of junk. That is, they have left stone tools, they have left bones of animals that they have consumed, they have left a number of different um, artifacts along the way that give us a picture of their life. And so archaeologists fundamentally are invested in the junk of the past and, believe it or not, the junk of the day. Let me move on and share with you this very notion. What is the junk? The junk of today is still being explored in various um, municipal um, disposal centers where archaeologists will go to find out what are the patterns inherent in our lifestyle. All right, so you wouldn't think they'd be interested in today's stuff. But the question you might want to ask yourself is what would archaeologists be interested in the next 2,000 years? What might be the junk of the day that captures their interest? Technology, automobiles, food stuff? I leave it to you to make that decision. So one of the things we want to do next is look at some of the terminology that our archaeologists use. These are very basic ideas in the archaeological endeavor, and you are probably familiar with them, but let me go over them rapidly. First, we have artifacts. What are artifacts? These are things that owe their characteristics to what people do, a human activity. So nothing is an artifact unless it's produced by a person. So whether it's a beautifully shaped figurine of 15,000 years ago or a discarded stone flake that was thrown into a field, nonetheless, these are items made by people. A feature is something that is not portable, and a site is a concentration of both artifacts and features. So you can see ancient junk. So at the time, these arrowheads were considered just ordinary materials of the day. And you could see also images here of other things that people had fashioned, but they're not necessarily the most important thing in their life. So junk of that day is now archaeological and museum worthy material. Feature, you can, as I mentioned earlier, feature is something that is not portable. And here we have the example of a hearth. And you see that this is part of a site, but it can't be moved. And so features reflect repeated activity. That's the most important point about features. Finally, is the site. Here you have on the slide an image of Babylon. And what is a site? A site is a concentration of these artifacts and features. Here you see the city of Babylon in contemporary Iraq, which comprises a huge mound of slowly dissolving baked brick buildings, millions of pottery fragments. And so the other area of interest for archaeologists that I haven't put on the slide are what is considered non-sites or off-sites. And what are these? These are the spaces between sites. So let's just say there is a site close to Babylon that you are exploring. As a consequence, you want to look at the space between Babylon and that other site. Why? Well, there's a lot going on. There could have been uh, transportation routes. It might have been involved other kinds of dynamics relative to the society of Babylon and its neighboring um, village or other society. So it's the space between that has also captured the interest of archaeologists. Um, you see the disintegrating mounds of Babylon. Now, you say to yourself, how do people find these sites? Well, there are a couple of different ways. I'm not going to go into great depth here, but let's talk about a few. So let me start with um, ground penetrating radar, for example. This is where the radar will send signals that bounce off of a subsurface anomaly, such as a structure or burial or some other feature. And you could use these anomalies and then start to map them. And eventually have a general sense of what's there. As a consequence, you might say, oh, I have found a residential dwelling. And you don't have to start digging. You now have some imagery, if you will, that allows you to plot your next step. Uh, a very interesting historical and contemporary approach is that of aerial photography. Aerial photography has been used in archaeology since the 1920s. The reality there is that it has helped us discover quite a few things. Let me show you. Now here's a Roman fort from 2,000 years ago. You would not see this if you were on foot at this site. All right, there's no way. But from a relatively um, modest altitude, um, someone taking photographs could see the relief in terms of the different um, soil marks, the colors, that which is more dense and that which is more pale. And you could see that the dense area is giving us an outline of in this case, a fort. Here we have satellite image, and I'm going to spend a little time here because this is a significant archaeological outcome. And the outcome here is very important because no one had discovered these migration patterns after many decades of studying the Southwest Pueblo and other Indian groups. In fact, the archaeology of North America might be well described initially as the archaeology of the Southwest. Many books, manuscripts, but with satellite imagery, we're able to identify this migratory pattern across the four state region, which is often identified as the four corners of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Now, looking at going to the start point in southern New Mexico, if you were to follow the most northern route, it goes through Colorado into southern Utah. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that this is quite a footpath, meaning that this is a mountainous region. When you get to the border of Colorado and New Mexico, even to today, there are no roads that go from Albuquerque, for example, up into Telluride, which would be right at the Colorado line where um, the, um, the arrow passes through. So you basically, even today, have to go very far east to pick up the main highway that goes into Colorado from New Mexico. So here are these people. Who would have even envisioned that people would be making a trek across mountains, across mountainous region? And then look at the depth into Arizona. Um, so this shows us a very different type of society, something about the socio-political and economic relationships that we can now assess in terms of the Pueblo peoples. So, very interesting. So, how do you visually identify a site? Well, there are five basic ways of doing this, and I'll run through them very quickly. But you can see from the slide, I'll just name them: tells, soil marks, folklore clues, middens, and after construction, which means material found during the construction process. A tell is a um, human-made mound that is easily identified because it swells out of the ground and has no compatibility with the topography of the region. So it's very obvious. So here we are in the Middle East, and this tell uh, is readily identified by archaeologists as a mound. The topsoil is probably richer on top based on whether or not there's organic material in the tell itself. So the next, give you another insight here. You could see there is no way that this is part of the general topography. It is a human-made mound that has no relationship to the topographical um, uh, mapping of this region that they're exploring. Soil marks. You saw this in the Roman fort in terms of the aerial photography. What this is all about is that there are paler and much more intensely colored areas, and these are in relation to what is beneath the surface. So you could see here, there's a pale area that clearly shows the line of an old wall. Why is this? Well, there's not a very good transmission of nutrients because this wall is blocking the exchange from the top surface to the underneath part of the area. Contrary to this would be heavy nutrients that are flowing up to the surface, creating a much more intense mark on the soil called a crop mark. Those are more intense green color. And why is this? Because there are burial grounds and there might be organic material that actually are making nutrient-rich deposits that are allowing faster and faster growth from above. Okay, so as a consequence, you can make some observations about what's beneath. Here are mounds that were discovered from soil marks. Now these were dug out already in England, but initially it was just like we had seen in the Roman fort. After they did the digging, they found that these were burial mounds, very lush, distinctive surface. Now, the other thing is folklore. Now, I do not want to dismiss this as something that is fully irrelevant. So let's take this gentleman here. Okay, I think I'm pronouncing his name somewhat correctly, Schliemann. Um, he he has come up with the idea that the Iliad, uh, Homer's Iliad, made some sense to him. This postage stamp is celebrating his discovery of Troy. Um, Now, why do I say that this is not to be dismissed? He said that he read in the Iliad the very directions to the city of Troy. His reading, however he did it, is to be understood as something extraordinary. However, this is not to dismiss folklore. There are many people who are in a community archaeologists that is, talking to people, and they're sharing with them uh, potentially oral histories. Someone in their past told them that someone in their past, like so someone said, my grandfather has a story about there being burial mounds a few kilometers from here. And his grandfather told him about that. And so you might want to take that as a clue that maybe there's something to this. It could be just um, um, uh, uh, erroneous information, but it might not be. So something not to dismiss. Um, Here we have his finding of Troy, and you can see the application of the Trojan War here to the site. Um, I'm sorry, let me go back here and talk to the next item would be middens. Now, what are middens? Middens are fundamentally uh, trash deposits, but these are exposed. They're generally exposed from a erosion process or uh, well, yeah, typically erosion um, from coastlines or riverbanks. And these middens this is a close-up of a gully uh, that was exposed from erosion. And so people made the assumption that the archaeologists made the assumption that the people living in this region were basically eating a lot of shells, food, seafood, shell food, meaning that there were thousands of shells. These people were eating clams, mussels, and the like. So shell food, um, shellfish consumption was substantial. Now here we have erosion at a much more dramatic level, and here we have the wind, uh, the gradual action of the wind blowing away sand, exposing a whole village of stone huts. This is quite dramatic. Nobody did any digging. This is the process of erosion. Okay, so this is in the Scotland's Orkney Islands. These huts emerge. All right, and then sometimes there is the work of people in quarries and in construction that actually expose sites. So here we have this obvious wall. This is not part of a quarry. You can see that this was something constructed. And so the quarry work has stopped as archaeologists investigate what possibly uh, could account for this wall. Now, many things are found this way. Remember, we talked about the finding of Australopithecus africanus that was given the Raymond Dart. The whole idea here is that he didn't find it. Somebody working in a limestone quarry came upon this skull and then presents it to an archaeologist. All right, so this is many finds in South Africa, particularly in the early 20th century, led to the discovery of many hominins. So this is not to be dismissed. But it also turns up repeatedly fragments of pots and bones and other archaeological objects. Now, the process of the dig. The dig has a very stylized approach. That is, you make a grid, you do a lot of recording, you're working in stratified layers, you're then taking the material back to the lab for further evaluation and recording and analysis. All right, so here we go. The first step is you've discovered your site, and now you want to set up a grid. Now this grid is made up. You can see some string has been drawn, and now the gentleman squatting next to that rectangle. Let's call that A1, and then to his elbow would be maybe B1. You see, or A2, depending on how they arrange the sequencing. Nonetheless, this is very important because people want to go back and look at the relationship between A1 and A2 or B1. So the grid is And here you see more grid work, but this grid work now we have to look at a horizon. Okay, here we go again. Remember Tim White talking about the multiple horizons in Ardipithecus ramidus's discovery? Well, so we're working with not only um, uh, width and length, we're also working with depth. And you remember he said that there were multiple horizons, stratified layer after stratified layer revealing archaeological material. So here you see again digging into the stratified grid. Thomas Jefferson, I might just want to bring this as an aside, was a early archaeologist among his other talents. He actually found this mound on his property. Now, unlike the thinking of the day, he actually believed that Native Americans might have made these mounds. Others thought that these were the work of Europeans that were before the days of Jefferson. Nonetheless, he actually did one of the first digs in North America through this mound, and sure enough, he discovered many uh, burial artifacts. So here's the work, digging through the mound, layer by layer. Very, very interesting story, and something to look into if you're interested in Jefferson's wide variety of talents. Now, removing bones. You just can't pick up a bone out of a site. It has to be removed in a very delicate way. You could see here there's a sequence of delicate wrapping, preparing a matrix, which is a block of soil surrounding the bone, and then enclosing it in burlap and plaster. And so you can see here's the fine work with brushes, and oftentimes they'll be using dental instruments like a dental pick and fine camel hair brushes to get off initial debris. Um, then the next step is to really dig out a section of that where the bones are, a big square, and they'll dig this out, and in doing so, they will then wrap it. They will wrap this with burlap and then plaster, and then do it again and let it dry over a couple of days. This block, this now block of soil encasing the bones, is now wrapped to protect the bones in this burlap and plaster. This is then put in a further container for shipping back to the laboratory. So it's not a simple thing just to lift the bone. You have in films, you'll see someone discovers the skull and they just jump at it and they lift it. Well, you got to be very careful handling this. One, destroys the site, and two, it could dissolve in your hand, depending on the level of this. It's how fragile it is. So that single block is called the matrix. Okay, that gets covered. But the key here is sorting the evidence. So it goes back to the lab. There's a lot of cleaning. We talked about looking at full skeletons like in Ardipithecus ramidus or in Lucy. Remember Australopithecus afarensis. In both cases, they had to clean those bones, and most important, catalog. So let's just say your first cataloging is a clavicle bone. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, I'm getting more of the body parts here, so I'm going to be able to now construct the whole skeleton, and as a consequence, you have a very, very different type of process going on, because you know what's in your catalog, and now you could say, wait a minute, I have almost the entire anatomy of this hominin. Other things that go on are microscopic evaluation, very important. We talked about Neanderthals being right-handed. We know this from abrasion on their teeth. They might have been holding a hide or something in their mouth and then rubbing across their mouth a stone tool or something to cut the hide and leaving behind micro abrasions to their teeth. We also can look at microscopic evaluation of teeth for dietary information about the group. Now, DNA analysis is very much the bread and butter of archaeology today, and this is very much involved in looking at, what can we say about these hominids, for example. Now, remember we talked about ancient DNA and trying to sort out did Neanderthals have a relationship to others, Homo sapiens in particular. And so DNA is attempted to be recovered. They use PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction, to replicate sufficient amounts of material to perform analysis. And then they go about looking at the DNA. Now, ancient DNA is becoming quite a sophisticated business, but still at 50,000 years, it becomes increasingly unreliable due to decay. But if you want to follow the outcomes, I would recommend that you look at the work of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. They are leaders in DNA analysis of ancient remains. Faunal analysis, as remember Tim White said that they collected many, many animal bones, is just what it is. It's the animal remains that are found in the site or at the site, and this gives us information about the finds, the hominid finds as well. Floral analysis can speak for itself. You're looking at here pollens as well as remains of other plant life. That would give you some sense of seeds, for example, that are well preserved, or carbonized plant remains. These can all give us insight into what is the era, what is the horizon that we're working in. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about artifact analysis, like pottery, just to make this very clear. People confuse these two terms all the time, shards and sherds. A shard is a glass fragment. A sherd, a pot sherd, is a piece of pottery, a fragment of pottery. Ceramics serve as a great area of study and analysis, because not only because of the analysis you can do with our techniques of dating, and but you could also look at it for style and try to understand something about the cultural rendition. And here we have pot shards, and you could see what I mean, the pieces of pottery. We also, you can see people look at kilns and how this pottery is made. So one of the things I want to share with you is that the analysis of pottery can be very complex because it is based on both style and design. And there are people who dedicate an entire career, for example, to Mayan pottery, based on one era to the next, based on the actual coloration. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to conclude here. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, or any other way you want to contact me so that we can talk further about this. Thanks again. Bye-bye.